Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the SAIEE Load Research Chapter's webinar entitled The Impact of Lockdowns on Load Demand in South Africa, a review of actual data. Before we start, I just want to read out a few webinar considerations for attendees. Attendees are reminded to ensure the volume is turned up on their device. Ensure you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and audio will run smoothly. Attendees can ask questions via the questions panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. By default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for webinar organizers and panelists to communicate with attendees. Attendees will not be able to chat with each other, however, are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of the presentations will be made available on the SAIEE YouTube channel, SAIEE TV. The recording will also be made available on the SAIEE website under the events drop-down menu in the section past events and webinars. This page is updated regularly, so ensure you check back as often as possible for new uploads and subscribe to our YouTube channel. A certificate of attendance will be issued a few weeks after this webinar once we have received the CPD validation number from EXA. I'd like to introduce you now to the chairman of the SAIEE Load Research Chapter, Mr Monde Soni. Monde is the chairman, as I said, of the SAIEE Load Research Chapter. He is also leading few working groups focused on distribution, network planning and analysis. Monde is an elected member of the Council for SAIEE, a voluntary contribution position he has held since 2017. He was awarded the Engineer of the Year 2019 by SAIEE, the achievement he holds close to his heart. I hand you over now to Monde.
Thank you, Mins. Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. As having been introduced, my name is Monde Soni, and I'm excited that we are finally here now. Just about the session for today. So if some of you will recall that last year we had a series of sessions like this one, panel discussions, etc., where we focused on what we thought, or we were trying to guess or forecast the impact that the lockdowns would have on the demand behavior, as well as on the power system in general. So now at this point in time, there is data that we can interrogate, that we can interpret, and we can start to extract some information out of that data. So there were many predictions that we put forward last year, and none of them were wrong, as again, they were predictions. But now, as I'm saying, we do have data. So I have spoken to a panel of experts who are my friends that I know very well, and they will be presenting to us what they have seen coming through from their spaces. They are all from different organizations, and we really thank them for their presence. So without any further ado, I'm going to firstly introduce the first speaker. The first speaker is Dr. Jarrad Wright. Dr. Jarrad Wright is a qualified electrical engineer with a PhD from Wits University. He is also a registered professional engineer with EXA, and he is a member of SAIEE, CGRE, and IEEE. He has extensive experience in energy sector in over 11 African countries. He is currently based at CSIR Energy Center in Pretoria, South Africa. He works there as a principal engineer, predominantly involved in energy systems, operations, and planning, sector coupling, system stability, network planning, resource forecasting, storage, as well as enabling market arrangements. Jarrad is also a commissioner on the South African NPC. NPC is the National Planning Commission. He has been in this position from 2015 up to 2020, as he was appointed by the president of the country. So without any further ado, I would like to hand over to Jarrad to give us his 5 minutes presentation as an opening statement. Thank you. Over to you, Jarrad.
Yes, thank you, Chair, for the welcome, and I do hope that you can see the screen. I'll provide you with 5 insights in 5 minutes, I hope, and then hand over to our fellow panelists to provide you some other perspectives. The perspective that I'll be providing is mostly at a transmission level, so at a national level more specifically. And just to say that the first one, national demand actually has been declining for more than a decade now. It was exaggerated during 2020 as a result of COVID-19 induced lockdowns and constrained economic activities that came from that. This is just shown here in this graphic, where you can see that on the basis of some public domain data that we've been scraping for a while now, and it's been made available by Eskom. You see all the way back to 2010 the decline over time, about 4.3% over 9 years. And then last year really just doubled that up to 8.8% in 2020. I'm pretty sure that the demand will come back in 2021. Maybe a prediction, we shall see. But on average, the annual reductions that we've been seeing is anywhere between 0.5 to 0.9%. Last year, as I said, specifically about 4.8% relative to 2019. In 2020, we didn't start it necessarily very well with the supply-demand shortfall. We had load shedding in January, February, and March, but then COVID-19 came. So the second insight here is that our actual demand-side response, or manual load reduction, which is essentially a measure of load shedding to balance the power system, occurred for the first 3 months, as I was saying there, January, February, and March. It then went away when we were under level 5 of the lockdown. When we went back to level 4, level 3, and 2, you started to see that just towards the end of winter, and as we went into the third quarter, that a lot of load shedding started to occur. So that's the gray areas that you see on a monthly basis. The information is sort of summarized on the right-hand side in terms of annual demand-side response, the load shedding being about 1,269 gigawatt hours. You'll also notice, though, that the information shown here includes interruption of supply as well as interruptible load supply. So it's a combination of voluntary reductions as well as contractual reductions that Eskom have on the demand side, as well as interruptible loads. So that's more related to managing network congestion and protecting network equipment. In terms of the third insight, monthly demand reductions that we saw was up to 20%. That was in April 2020. And you'll see that here in this slide, where we went all the way from the 19.6 or 18.9, 19.6 terawatt hours that we saw in February and March, where we did have quite a significant amount of load shedding, all the way down to 15.2 terawatt hours as a result of the level 5 lockdown. The average through the year was about 19 terawatt hours per month. But as you can see, straight away into May, June, July, the demand really returned back towards expected levels, and that's where the load shedding did return. Insight number 4, weekly demand reduction now. So you see I went from annual to monthly and now onto weekly. Weekly demand reductions at a national level were quite significant, up to 25% reduction. And that 25% reduction was seen for in the order of about 6 weeks. But as I said, that demand did quickly return. And I'll show that here in this slide quickly, going from about that 4.6 terawatt hours just towards the middle, towards the third week of March. And then as we went into a full lockdown on the 26th of March last year, right down to just about 3,400 gigawatt hours, or 3.4 terawatt hours. You'll see that the makeup of this demand, although I haven't focused on it in the previous slides, is obviously predominantly based on the coal supply. But you do see that that really is also then, as a result of that, what takes up the balancing. So a lot of the coal had to reduce quite significantly during this period. And that's one of the next insights, actually, finally, which is that on an instantaneous level, on an hourly basis at least, we saw up to 11 gigawatts deviation in the demand relative to expectations. And this was seen under the level 5 of our lockdown, and about 8.5 gigawatts during level 4 of the lockdown, as similarly minimum demand also dropped right down to 13.8 gigawatts. That's shown here in this graphic here for the entire year, actually also for a little bit of January 2021. So you can see there from the just about the end of March, the level 5 lockdown in red, where we went all the way up to that 11.5 gigawatts of differential, or 11 gigawatts, sorry, differential in level 5. Under level 4, the orange period there, you see that it's about 8.5 gigawatts, and you see that starts to fall away as well as into winter, where sort of the deviation is actually in the negative. So relative to expectations, it was actually a little bit larger, as expected and to be expected as a result of variations in weather as well as other performance of the supply, because this is a residual demand that's being shown here. So that is the second last slide, just to talk to diurnal courses or averages of these for 2020. So if you take January all the way to December and you average every day, you can see that January, February, and March was quite constrained, a particularly consistent demand profile, of course. But you see the open cycle gas turbines in that sort of light cream color being run quite hard. That then largely falls away for the entire month of April, as I was showing you previously, returning back towards May, but not necessarily very constrained. But then you see during the winter months, June, July, August, a return to quite a peaky demand profile. And as I was just showing here, the winter profile actually came quite early, where you see that peaky profile already in April, moving towards May, June, July, and then August. And then back towards the typical summer profile, as you see in the late parts of the third quarter and into the fourth quarter. And particularly in December, you see the system being quite constrained as in order to meet that demand. A lot of solar PV is expected, a lot of wind, but still dominated by the coal. But you see that sliver of open cycle gas turbines returning, indicating the level of constrained supply-demand balance towards the end of last year. So just summarizing all 5 of those that I was talking to, our national demand has been declining over time. It was just exaggerated in 2020. It didn't start necessarily very well on the demand side, where we did start with quite significant amounts of load shedding in January, February, and March. But then COVID-19 hit towards the end of March. We saw monthly demand reductions of about 20% in April. We saw weekly demand reductions of about 25% for up to a 6-week period. But then demand did quickly return, as I was mentioning, and on an instantaneous basis, up to 11 gigawatts during level 5, 8.5 gigawatts in level 4, and minimum demand dropped right down to 13.8 gigawatts, so just below 14 gigawatts. So that is my initial opening comments and inputs for tonight, and I hand over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Jarrad. Colleagues, I just want to also mention one thing here, just something that comes to mind now. Let us please, if you want to ask questions, please write the name of the presenter or the panelist that you are directing the question to, so that when we read the questions out at the end, they know who the question was addressed to. Or you can say to all if you want all of them to respond. Okay, thanks, Jarrad. Then the next presenter, you also have 5 minutes as well, is Alois van Deventer. Alois is an electrical engineer by qualification who holds a master's in electrical engineering. Her passion is in power systems operation and electricity market. She is currently pursuing a PhD with the University of Cape Town. Alois, I would like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I would like to acknowledge my team. Let me see if you can see my screen. The team that I've been working with, and so this is a collaboration of the various members of my team. And if you'd recall that we were here last year, just after lockdown, and we are here now to provide an update on what we have seen from a lockdown perspective and impact on demand and the economy. This is just a disclaimer in terms of what we'll be covering and what the focus is for tonight. I'm going to go right into the detail. Our view is going to cover the demand view, our sectoral view. We'll have a view of the economic as well, and then we will close with the regional view. So what you can see from a demand perspective, when we were here previously, we showed the reduction in level 5 and level 4, which was up to 14 and 10%. And we are comparing the actual demand data with the forecast as was provided in February of 2020. So this was prior the COVID impact. And then subsequent to that, you can see that for the period from level 3 onwards, demand has been trending fairly consistent with what was forecasted originally. And you see then there is a shift, a significant reduction then in level 3.1, which was closer in December of last year when the lockdown level 3.1 was announced. And then you see an additional 4% reduction as well for the month of January if we compare the actuals with the expected demand. Also significant to note on this particular slide is that the winter period, which is it's over here, it's level 3. You can see that demand has been trending fairly consistent with what was provided from a forecasting perspective. Then on this slide, we're showing you detail on a sectoral contribution from an Eskom perspective. Significant to note here is that the residential and commercial sectors are the ones that is supplied directly by Eskom, and the rest of the commercial and residential sectors are within the redistributors together with other sectors. And then lastly, the international and losses are excluded in the demand contribution in this graph. So to note here is that level 5 were in April. So you can see here that the contribution from the redistributor was 45. And you can see here is the green one is the traction. We have commercial, residential, and here we have the commercial one. So looking at how we were tracking in when the level 3.1 was announced, you see that there is a shift in the commercial sector here, and there is a reduction in the redistributor section. So these are just points that to keep in the back of your mind, noting that the work from home policy, which most companies have implemented, has caused a shift in the sectoral profile. But we can see that some of it has returned as the levels were eased, and most people have returned to offices as well, or some people have returned. Then this one is around the GDP view, which is the economic view. And previously, when we looked at this, we saw the GDP was contracting about 2%, and the primary sector, secondary sectors showed reductions, and the tertiary showed an increase. Then this time around, the detail comparison of Q1 2020 versus Q4 2020, the GDP contracted up to about 7%, and you can see that there's a slight increase in the primary sector, significant increase in the secondary sector, and then some increase in the tertiary sector as well. So 8 of the 10 industries recorded a decrease in economic activities in 2020 compared to 2019. However, tertiary, secondary, and primary sectors individually recorded the highest growth in Q4 of 2020. Then lastly, from a regional demand level perspective, and this one compares the COVID spikes that we have had, the wave 1 and the wave 2. So how the slide works is that you'd see on the left-hand side, on my left-hand side, these are the provinces, and it's a heat map. So it's showing you the percentage reduction compared to its actual demand per province. I'm going to pick on just the Western Cape as an example. So in level 5, you could see that Western Cape in the month of April, the usage or demand use was around about 70%. And then you can see as the levels are eased, the demand usage is increased. Then when level 3 was announced in the beginning of June, you can see that some of the impact is a bit delayed, because now you can see that as the levels was changing, then the demand usage is then decreasing again. There are some anomalies which we were here before. We spoke about the Northern Cape, the Northwest, which are predominantly mining areas. And what we showed before was that the activity, when you tracked it, you could see that there were anomalies in terms of the levels are relaxed, and yet it shows that the demand reduction, the demand was sustained as a reduction. So what you see now on the yellow graph is just the first spike from an impact perspective, and this is the second spike. So significant to note here is that when we were in level 5, which was the first level that we've experienced, significant economic and demand reduction was experienced. Yet in level 3, you can see even in level 3.1, the spike was much higher than what we were experiencing in level 3. And if you look at the economic impact, you can see that this looks fairly light, which means that demand wasn't that significantly impacted as one would expect. I think those are then our key summaries from that slide. There is some correlation that can be seen in demand decrease as the COVID numbers from the graph overlay. And also to keep in mind is that most industrial, mining and manufacturing industries slowed production down during December and January for the year-end break and maintenance. And then lastly, summary. Lockdown level 5, 4 and 3 definitely has had the most significant impact from a demand perspective. During the winter period, while in lockdown level 3, demand was still relatively high. In September, during lockdown level 2, there seems to be a shift in sectoral profile, even though some industries remain working from home. There is an increase in the commercial sector that we can see. And then although lockdowns are expected to continue in 2021, an increase in economic activity is already seen. Significant to note here is the mining and agriculture has been showing some growth, while secondary manufacturing and construction areas have been showing significant growth. Then the GDP is expected to return to a growth of between 2 and 3.5% as forecasted by Fitch Solutions, IMF, Reserve Bank, and Econometrics respectively. A full recovery from the COVID impact is only expected in a 3 to 5 year period. And then the impact of the lockdown levels correspond with a decrease in demand and in economic activity to some extent. More work definitely needs to be done to zoom into the provincial profiling, as we have noted. There are some anomalies as the lockdown levels are eased, which needs additional in-depth analysis. And that is all from my side. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Alois. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to the next, I'm going to introduce the next speaker, which is Vasu Chetty. Vasu Chetty is currently a chief engineer in high voltage planning within eThekwini Electricity. He holds B.Eng and M.Eng in power and energy, and he is currently pursuing his doctorate. Thanks, Vasu, over to you.
Good evening, colleagues. My name is Vasu Chetty, and I'm currently a planning engineer, transmission planning engineer at eThekwini Electricity. I want to also acknowledge my colleagues for providing me with the data that I'm going to be using today in today's presentation. So if we look at the makeup, or I'll begin with a background of eThekwini Electricity. We've got currently approximately 760,000 customers, and we essentially purchase power from Eskom at 275 kV, 132 kV, and 11 kV. Our consumption on average is around the 900 megawatt hours per month, and over the last few years, we've seen a peak demand of roughly 1,680 megawatts. Essentially, we've got large power users. We've got refineries in eThekwini. We've got Monde, Toyota, and other manufacturing plants, which take up most of our load. So I had a look at the entire lockdown loads, megawatt hours consumed. And what I had seen was that the most significant months were obviously March, April, and May, into June and July, where we saw a normalizing of the load. And so I decided to focus on these months in my presentation. If we look at the consumption for those months, we had lockdown starting end of March and then going into April. There's roughly a 200 megawatt hour decrease in our consumption pattern. And this then equated also to roughly around 300 megawatts in our peak demand. When we went into May, June, and July, we saw the load actually, or the consumption actually evening out. And for the rest of the lockdown, they were within these regions of around the lower 800 to early 900 megawatt hours. If we then look at the customer consumption categorized, we'll see that there was not a very significant decrease in demand in the residential sector. If you look at the first graph, that's March, and then going into April, there was a decrease, and then this then picked up, which is also more or less what some of the other colleagues have mentioned so far. The business and general customers also saw a similar decrease in April, and then more or less a steadying of that consumption going into May and June. The greatest decrease we saw was with our bulk customers, which are our large power users, our refineries, our bigger manufacturing industries within eThekwini. And this decreased by quite a significant amount, which I would go into the percentages later on into my slides. The other areas that I've looked at was a free basic electricity, which is more or less constant, and our prepaid customers as well, which remained fairly constant over that period of time. If we then look at a comparison between the 2019 and 2020 consumption as a percentage change, we'll see that as per the previous slide, there was a decrease in demand of around 40% with our bulk users. And there were decreases in all across the other users as well, but a lot of them then regained or started consuming more or less what they used to previously. The other significant thing to notice in this is that there was just a slight increase in the residential demand in June, and then that hovered around the, let's say plus minus 5% region for the rest of the year. When we look at the, so basically in this graph, what I'm trying to show is the consumption pattern or the daily load curve for our largest substation, which is a 275 kV to 132 kV substation. And we roughly, bring in load or power from Eskom at this substation, and it feeds possibly 60 to 65% of our customers. If we look at the daily load curves for these for 2019 versus 2020, and I've taken the day with the maximum demand and I've compared these two, we see that as expected over the lockdown period in April, there was a shift and a shape change. We see that peak or the rise from your nighttime load to daytime load, there was a significant shift in that, roughly around 2 hours. And what we've also seen is that the actually daily load is fairly flat, which then increases towards the afternoon in both curves, and then decreases again. So in conclusion, when we looked at some of the operating issues that we might have had, over the year on the HV and the MV side, we didn't see any significant load shifts or power flows experienced amongst the different areas and the customers as well. However, our network operators did have to adjust loads for lower load conditions. And our MV operators had to also closely monitor for cable overloads. However, none were actually experienced. So going forward, when we're planning our networks, whether it's on the HV side or the MV side, we then need to design for more resilience and flexibility to basically withstand major events that might happen on the network. We also need to have network models that are updated regularly. And these are your post-system, also forecasting models. And going forward as well, I know that some of the utilities are looking at MV SCADA, which would then provide us with the information to actually make more informed decisions at very short notice. So we should also have built into our models different scenarios planned so that we will be able to act quickly, should our demands change. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Vasu. Now, again, without any further waste of time, I would like to introduce Ina. Ina Nel is with the City of Cape Town. She holds a BEng in Electrical and Electronic Engineering from Stellenbosch University. She currently works as a long-term network planner. Over to you, Ina.
Good evening, all. The rest of my panelists has actually made it very easy for me, because you'll see much more of the same of what you've already seen tonight. But okay, if we look at what happened within the City of Cape Town, I'm currently sharing our maximum system demand. So that's instantaneous power as we've experienced it during the different levels. So we'll see the most profoundly in April, more or less about 12% reduction, very good recovery in level 4. In May, about 2.5% reduction, and then nearly back to what it was in June, which was at the start of level 3. Level 3 then continued into July. Mid-July, however, there was the announcement again to prohibit liquor and alcohol sales. And then in August, we had more or less the same peak demand. September, October, November, a higher demand than what it was in 2019. It's almost as if we tried to catch up for lost times. And then in December, again, lower than what it was before, most probably because we were moving into our second COVID peak again. And I think there was this anticipation that we're going to move into a stricter level, which actually then happened at the end of December. So that's the end where we are here in 2021. So we can see quite a significant drop for January and February, where we moved into adjusted level 3. City of Cape Town was at that stage still a hotspot area. Liquor sales were prohibited again, and then I think our tourism industry suffered quite a bit. Our beaches and dams and lakes and rivers and public swimming pools were all closed down again. And then for me, very recent was a bit of a surprise what happened then in March when we moved into adjusted level 1, but we haven't really seen the recovery in March. So more or less a 2.5% reduction for those 3 months year on year. Okay, and then this slide just shows the average daily profiles according to the different alert levels for one of our supply areas, which is predominantly a non-residential load. We can see peaking through daytime. So in level 5 and in level 4, we could actually see the load profile started to change. The residential component inside of the supply area started dominating the peaks within level 5 and 4. We kind of recovered a bit here in level 3, but not there yet. Level 2, your commercial load taking the peak again, as well as within level 1. And then on the yellow graph again is where we are within adjusted level 3. So that was January and February of this year. And a bit alarming is the reduction that we are seeing here with our minimum demand, and we can see it even within adjusted levels 1. So the question is here, normally when we see a reduction in the minimum demand, we expect that we are losing customers. So that would be a bit of a concern over here. And this adjusted level 1, we can see this drop is much more significant, where in the previous level 1, we didn't really see the drop in minimum demand. Right, so if we then just have a brief look also at our predominantly residential supply area, we can see the peak loading nearly didn't change. So the evening peaks were throughout very profound. And yeah, it's maybe just the morning peak in levels 5 and 4 where we can see a bit of change. Maybe the residents are not going to work, obviously, because we were in hard lockdown, and then slightly starting to recover, and that small business component picking up again from level 3 onwards. And then similar to what Aloise has indicated, in level 2, we kind of saw that increase in the morning peak again with some of our consumption. Okay, so then just some lessons learned and maybe some future considerations. So we've actually seen that the non-residential consumers were definitely more severely impacted by the alert levels than our residential consumers. If we have to make a choice in terms of where we want to spend our money, whatever remains of it has been channeled to COVID relief, the idea would be to reconsider your MV network strengthening projects for your non-residential consumption, because it's very likely that your load has decreased so much that previous unfirm networks are actually firm at the moment. And then I think for me, definitely working through this analysis, I think there's a lot of future unknowns, especially if I started to look at the past 3 months, is then to closely look out for the reduction in our high-paying non-residential consumers. There are questions surrounding, the future of work, how many of the staff has actually been set up completely to work remotely. Is there going to be this change maybe in residential consumer behavior? We haven't really seen it from the example that I've shared. And then, the question about how many of the office space is going to be turned into residences, especially in those previously high non-residential consumer networks. Okay, and then also maybe posing a future unknown is to say, how is the economic sectors going to pan out in the post-COVID world, and what would be the related impact on our electric networks? So as I've mentioned there, it would be very interesting to make linkages between our industries, our tourism industries, and everything that goes with it, hotels, restaurants, the ban on the liquor sales and how it actually impacted the loading. And then what is, everything seems very much digitalized. So is e-commerce going to potentially change some of the load as we see it going forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Ina. Then, colleagues, I would like to request all panelists to just please switch on their cameras, and we are going to get into a discussion where we try to put some context into the presentations and the numbers that have been shared thus far. I will start by just asking a question each, and let's just try and be brief and just go straight to the point, because I can see that there are questions as well that are coming from the delegates that have tuned in. So I'll just start with you, Jarrad. You have shown some good analysis on the energy consumption nationally, and I think you did mention that it had already been declining, and it was just made worse now by mainly the COVID lockdowns. Do you think that now the trend is just going to be exacerbated going forward in terms of the decline in energy demand nationally going forward? Can you hear me? Guys, can you hear me? Can someone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Monde.
Okay, I think Jarrad, perhaps he lost. Okay, perhaps he lost
connection temporarily.
Oh, sorry about that. Did you get my question though?
I lost it right at the end, but you were talking to the long-term demand reduction and then how it was exacerbated in 2020, but I didn't get the question right at the end.
Yes, so maybe just as a way of example, we know what happened in 2008, 2009 in terms of the decline that came with the recession, and I think we've had many contractions that have happened in after that, and we have seen how those have had impact or not on the demand nationally. So what I just want to know from your side is, what is your take now that we've had COVID going forward? Do you think now the decline in energy consumption nationally is going to get worse, or do you think it will remain at the same rate that it was before we had this COVID? What's your view?
I do think that in 2021 it will likely bounce back to similar levels, perhaps slightly lower than in 2019. Thereafter, I would really hope that energy demand does grow. And obviously the linkages to our economic recovery, post-COVID economic recovery would need to be quite clear there. It's really fascinating for me to actually see how at a localized level, across particular customer segments, how that demand has indeed shifted. So I think there are a lot of uncertainties though in terms of which sectors may grow, whether it's the large power users and heavy industrials or whether it's in manufacturing. It's a little bit unclear to me, but I think in the medium to long term, I would hope that energy demand does grow in order to get us to a point at which, at least from an energy demand per capita or electricity demand per capita, we would be able to get an increasingly growing middle class and into a sphere of economic growth that is more aligned with NDP goals, as opposed to the current economic growth trajectories more in the order of 2 to 3, some institutions looking at 4%. We actually need to be more towards 5% and more to grow towards 2030 to achieve our NDP goals. So in summary, I would like for the demand to grow, and I would expect for it to grow. I don't envision that it will continue to decline. It will at least remain flat this year and perhaps grow slightly in the years thereafter.
Yeah, we certainly hope for that, and it is good for the country. So, Alois, you have shown differences between provinces and how they have behaved, during that difficult 12-month period. We know that some provinces are more economically active than others, and some, are obviously just sort of holiday places where people just go to chill at the end of the year. Is there anything that perhaps we have picked, between provinces such as Gauteng Province, Western Cape, that are predominantly, they have got very high economic activity compared to provinces such as Eastern Cape and others? Was there anything interesting on those less economic active provinces? No, if we just leave the economic, the Gauteng and Western Cape, we just focus on Eastern Cape and the like. Is there anything that came up that seems to be interesting in those?
The interesting thing to note about the Eastern Cape, and thank you for your question, Monde, is that we would expect that in the December-January period, you would have a constraint from an economic perspective because we were in level 3.1, it was an adjusted level, and the Eastern Cape is predominantly a beach and tourism area. However, you'd see that, I think it's in the month just before December, that you see a reduction from a demand perspective in the Eastern Cape. And yet in the December and January period, it seems as if the Eastern Cape, from a demand perspective, it increases. So that was quite an interesting anomaly. The other anomaly we've noticed are in provinces like Northwest and Northern Cape. Now they are predominantly mining activity provinces. And the interesting thing to note around the 3.1 level, also in the December-January period, is that the economic activity also is, it seems as if it's unaffected by the announcement of that particular level. So the other provinces, little to note, not significant, but it seems as if most of the provinces, which is not as economic intensive as Gauteng province, are not majorly affected by the announcement of lockdown level 3.1.
Yeah. Now that is actually very interesting, and I now that also leads me to the next question to yourself, Vasu. There is something that I picked from your presentation, that even during that period when the lockdown was announced, we were expecting, especially in cities, we were expecting to see more load moving towards the residential area. And that doesn't seem to have been the case when the first lockdown was announced.
Yeah, Monde, that was surprising to me as well. So basically, we haven't seen much increase in that residential load. We've just seen decreases in your business and general, your bulk or your large power users, and there hasn't been a significant shift, into those residential areas. I think to really, answer that question, we've got to, really ask ourselves, if we look at the residential customer, and if we go into it in depth, we got to ask ourselves, what is he, even though he may be at home, what is he really using, and a breakdown of his appliances and so on, and hence, if you're working from home, then it's just basically a laptop, which is relatively low in terms of its consumption. The rest, your higher power, appliances or items that consume power, such as your geyser and so on, you'd probably still have it operating as normal. So that's the way I see it. It's just we got to then look into exactly what the residential customers are using while they are possibly working from home, and then we can answer those questions. But also, what was significant when I did speak to our MV operators, is that they did say that over the load shedding or the periods of load shedding, a lot of the problematic cables were actually upgraded because they had failed when the power came back on. So as a result, there were slight shifts. If there were slight shifts, between residential areas and so on, these would not have actually affected the network operations and breakdowns as such.
Yeah, but no, that's actually very interesting, and we always say that numbers do not lie, and I think that is what we always just need to remind ourselves, that we've got the actual numbers now, we've got the history. We want to understand what actually went down. Ina, lastly, from for you, I saw between August and November, you also mentioned it, that the demand just went up. What is it that was happening in that side of the world? Because we were expecting, things to be opposite. And also, I see that now in your graph for 2021 seems very, very low and quite strange. Is there anything perhaps from the ground, that a story behind that you would like to share with us?
Monde, it's very good questions. So I haven't had time to really go into those peaks that we've seen for September. I think we were just very, very excited to be out and about again. We saw spring happening, and we were very glad that just before Heritage Day we could actually move into level 1. So I think that's the upside there. And like I said, then December and the rest of the months that we've seen for the first quarter now, December, like I said, it's almost like people had anticipated that we're going to move into a stricter lockdown. So overall, already on the 3rd of December, there was that announcement about the resurgence of COVID, specifically then again in the Western Cape. On the 14th of December, the Garden Route was actually, all the beaches in the Garden Route district got closed down. And I think, people kind of anticipated that it's also going to happen within Cape Town. So people just stayed away, and you don't want to go to a COVID hotspot. So I think that's where December came. We as a city also cancelled some of our events, our Cape Town summer market that we usually have during December time. Yes, and then January and February, like we said, that January, February, March, that's our peak tourism times, but we were back in an adjusted level 3. So yeah, I think it kind of hit us hard.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Colleagues, I would like to open for questions now from our attendees. Marcus, do you have any questions from that side?
Yeah, Monde, we have 3 questions queued here. The first is from Nora Mahlangu. She has asked a question for Ina. I would like to check whether it is the low demand area on the load profile on the yellow graph not also caused by some of the load shedding that we have had at night. To repeat, I would like to check whether is the low demand area on the load profile on the yellow graph not also caused by some of the load shedding that we have had at night.
Thanks, Marcus, for the question. I haven't had a chance to actually see what the impact was of load shedding on these particular networks. I'm just trying to think now. I had the yellow graphs for both my residential consumer case study as well as for my commercial case study. And I'm not expecting the commercial load to be so severely impacted by load shedding during night times. And then the city try as best as possible to kind of mitigate at least one level of load shedding. When we try and run Steenbras, so I'm not too sure. It's something that I haven't investigated as yet.
Thanks. And this is the next one is a general question for. Do we also factor in the impact of the cost of electricity to the decrease in load as well? Question mark. So I think Nora has quite rightly spotted this general decrease in the levels, and is asking whether the price of electricity can be a contributor.
So may I suggest that Alois and then Jarrad take that question? Alois, you can go first.
Thank you for the question. Generally, the cost, if you're talking about cost, the impact would be in the winter period, which is June, July, and August. That's when we have the winter tariff, and that's when we would normally expect a demand reduction significantly, because most of the industry customers then reduce during that period. They do their maintenance, and so we normally see significant reduction from a demand perspective. However, this time during the lockdown period, when looking at the demand data, it has been, and looking at the forecast, you can see that it is very comparable. But when you look at the detailed sectoral profile, and you look at the mining customers, specifically for the period of June, July, and August, you'd see that in the month of July and August, there was a contraction in the usage, whereas in the month of June, they were fairly the same as what they were prior to the winter tariff period. So the answer is probably yes, there has been impact from a tariff perspective, and that you would normally see in the June, July, August period. Even though when you look at the overall demand at a national perspective, it's still been very comparable to what we have forecasted.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
I'd be happy to also contribute to that, Chair, if you don't mind. Just to add to what Eloise was saying in terms of the short-term impacts, there's probably a case to be made, and maybe even a research question to be answered around the long-term price elasticity relative to demand, which is that first slide that I was talking to, where we're seeing this sort of slow decline over time of that wholesale energy demand on the grid. And I don't necessarily have an answer to it. I think it's probably a combination of price, where various customers are then are responding more to price on an annualized basis, and tariff increases over time. combined with perhaps a level of grid reliability, which is a bit of a more softer sort of impact. So it's probably a combinatorial effect of price and then that reliability over time, where sort of different customers have been seeing load shedding and perpetual load shedding over extended periods. Sometimes in years it's there, sometimes in years it's not there. But on a general basis, the long-term impact seems to be that demand is declining, and perhaps customers are then starting to self-supply some of their needs along the way, and that might even perpetuate into the future. Like I said, it's a thought for now, and perhaps a research question that needs to be answered. An interesting one, nonetheless. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is something to be looked at, especially in our context. To have a clear understanding whether the price elasticity is really a thing going forward or not, because I think there are different schools of thoughts, that, but to have something that can be put on the table and we can say for sure this is scientifically proven that this is what is going to happen. I think that is something to be looked at. To those who are listening, maybe some university students, that is something that would be very interesting. There are case studies, of course, in other countries. Marcus, is there any other question from the floor?
Yes, Monty, there are two more. Second last one is, what is your prediction on the residential load profile? How will this impact on peaking power and technology selection? I guess that's to those looking at the stacked generation side. Is the question clear?
No. Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah. What is your prediction on the residential load profile? How will this impact on peaking power and technology selection?
Okay. Now, anyone who would like to take that? I think in terms of residential, Vasu and Ina, you can just comment on that and your prediction in terms of that, and perhaps Jarrad and Aloise, in terms of the peaking, what the method of peaking that would be appropriate.
Look, from the perspective of eThekwini, we've actually carried out 2 master planning exercises, and we tried to drill, into the actual usage of the user and consumers and so on. And what we've seen is that, over the past, let's say 10, 12 years, we have seen a decline in actual usage patterns of, users. They've become more energy efficient. And of course, the steep increases in tariff as well has resulted in them actually just using less power. And of course, moving over some of the, actual usages, maybe over to gas, for cooking, for instance, and so on. Going forward, so when we did our first master plan, we had estimated, let's say, for instance, medium density, medium income household to have roughly an ADMD of around, let's say, 4, but since, we've then gone and we've updated the master plan and we've seen that this has possibly dropped down to around 2.5. So that's quite a significant drop. So from my side, I don't think that residential usage can drop any further, apart from the fact that possibly residents might want to go solar geysers, and of course move a lot more, cooking, onto gas and so on. So I think they've sort of reached a minimum as far as the energy efficiencies go. The one thing that we are seeing in eThekwini is that, there is more and more people, let's say, for instance, going for cooling appliances like aircons and so on. And as a result, when we look at it from our major substations, our 132 to 11 substations, we're seeing that those, are seeing the effect is being seen at those substations, and also, of course, on our peaks as well. Whereas previously we had winter peaks, now we're getting summer peaks, of our demand. So that shift is taking place where, you know, in summer you're requiring more cooling than previously, where we used to see winter peaks, you know, due to heating. So I think going forward, you know, I don't see any more reduction in actual residential, you know, taking place.
Okay, thanks, Vasu. I think now we are just over our time. So I'd like to give each one of you maybe 30 seconds. Just give us your parting shot. Is there anything that you think the utilities need to worry about going forward? Based on what we know now, is there anything that we think that the utilities need to worry about? Just in 30 seconds each. You can go Ina first.
No, I think I'm just excited to see how everything is gonna pan out, and then yeah, maybe look forward to consumers becoming more smart, trying to get away from that large evening peak. Yeah, maybe look where energy storage is going to take us, and encouraging our consumers to get away.
Thanks, Ina. Vasu?
Look, so going forward, basically, you know, this disruption in the energy sector is going to continue. You know, we've seen demands change and so on. And of course, you know, the price of electricity would be increasing as well. So from a planning point of view, you know, planners then need to have a longer term, you know, outlook of their planning, of their plans going, you know, 20, 25 years into the future. Of course, with some triggers that, you know, would then cause them to then initiate projects, you know, and these then need to be closely watched, you know, so that you can obviously manage your capital outlay, you know, in a utility.
Yeah, thanks, Vasu. Alois?
I think the important thing to keep in the back of the mind, or something to note definitely, is the changes in the sectoral profile that we are seeing. On a national level, we've definitely seen a significant shift when lockdown level 5 was announced, and we can see the shift in the sectoral profiles all the way, and even when the lockdown levels was eased. So it's something to keep in the back of your mind, and I think not just the COVID impact, but also as the generation mix is changing, it's definitely something that in the future, it's from a residential or whatever the sector is, it's definitely something to be focusing on. Thank you.
Thanks, Alois. And lastly, Jarrad?
Yeah, the problem with going last is all the good ideas are taken. But I guess at a national level, in terms of where I would be able to comment a bit more, is the differential between the demand profile versus the residual demand as we deploy more and more solar and wind as part of the integrated resource plan existing policy. And that differential as to the mix that then needs to meet that residual demand going forward. It's going to be a very different mix or different fleet of generators to meet that demand. And similarly, a very different suite of, I guess, demand-side interventions and distributed energy technologies that could also come as part of that. So it would be interesting to watch that, whether it's commercial or residential or even large industrials, as to what they do. The impact will be quite different for the likes of Eskom as the vertically integrated utility it is, as well as Munix as the distributors that they are.
Thanks, Jarrad. Colleagues, I really would like to thank you for your time and, you know, coming to sit around here at the table and to share your expertise, what you have seen coming through from your specific areas of responsibility. Jarrad from CSIR, I would like to say thank you. Alois from Eskom, Vasu from eThekwini municipality, eThekwini electricity, right? It's the same. Okay. And Ina from the city of Cape Town. Also behind all of this, we've got Minx, who has been pressing all the buttons at the back. We'd like to say thank you so much, Minx. And thanks for arranging us and making sure that we do everything on time. And also I'd like to mention the Executive Committee of the Load Research Chapter under SAIEE, There was a ghost voice here. Marcus, he calls it a ghost voice, but I think you need a deeper voice for that, Marcus. You know, if you want to call it a ghost voice, so it has to be much deeper. But thanks for the support. The Load Research Chapter members in general, guys, let us keep on making the impact to the industry. But most of all, the attendees that have shown up to come and listen to this panel of experts, we really we are grateful for the support that you have shown us. Please do look out for our future webinars and roundtable discussions like this one. We are trying to understand our space as time goes, and I think at some point we'll be able to look back and say, hey, you know, we were so stupid to think of this at that point in time, but then we will have a benefit of a hindsight. It is continuous learning so that we can also improve our methods of planning, power systems analysis, load research, and all the work that we need to do around the energy space. So with that, thank you so much. Have a great evening, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
So, goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.